This is Jenny, and she was a pilot who was known on YouTube as TN Flygirl, where she shared her aviation journey with the world, until one day she was flying with her dad and lost control of her aircraft and crashed, killing them both instantly. However, that's not the most disturbing part of this story, and even though I shared with you what no one was saying about this tragedy 2 years ago when it happened, now that the NTSB final report is out, the details are worse than what people imagined. So sit back and get ready, because this is one of the most shocking pilot mistakes that I've ever talked about. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Before we get started, let me just say that my heart goes out to Jenny's friends and family members that were left behind, and that this video is not for them, because I know we're going to talk about some things that are going to be difficult to hear, but the reason why I'm doing this is because I hope that it helps to save someone's life one day. Jenny was 44 years old, and if you've never heard of her, she started her aviation journey a few years ago and documented most of it on her Instagram, where she went by the handle 865flygirl. And she was also growing a large following on YouTube, where she was known as TN Flygirl, but almost all of her videos were removed from the channel after the tragedy. Now, it's not clear when Jenny started learning to fly, but what we do know is that she purchased this aircraft, a Piper PA-28 Cherokee, in June of 2021, and she did most of her flight training in it. If you're not familiar, this is a basic single-engine aircraft that's a reliable training platform for a lot of new pilots. Jenny passed her private pilot knowledge test in October of 2021, but she didn't pass her private pilot check ride until May of 22, about a year after she purchased the Piper Cherokee. However, what you need to know is that most student pilots have about 60 to 80 total flight hours when they pass their check ride, but according to the investigation, Jenny had 193.2 hours when she finally got her private pilot license, and 182.6 of those hours were flown with an instructor. Think about that for a minute. That's roughly 3 times as many hours as the average student. And just to break things down a little bit further, according to her Instagram, she flew her 3rd solo flight in September of 2021, which means that she probably started flight training right around the time that she bought the Piper Cherokee. Now, if that's true, she was averaging at least 17 hours of flight time a month, which is probably at least 10 flights a month. So it's not like she had big gaps in her training. But I want to be clear when I say that I thought this might be one of the biggest failures of the investigation, because there's no evidence that the NTSB contacted any of Jenny's initial flight instructors to determine why she struggled so much and how she managed to pass her private pilot check ride. Because honestly, based on what this investigation has revealed, I'd argue that Jenny never should have been allowed to fly a plane by herself. Now, I realize that might sound harsh, but the truth is that some people aren't made to be pilots, and my gut tells me that it's possible that one of the reasons it took Jenny so long to pass her check ride was because she had to find an instructor who would sign her off. And honestly, I think that's one of the problems with the industry. You see, if you have enough money to buy your own plane, you can probably afford to just change instructors as much as you want until someone finally says yes. That being said, Jenny's story is about to get a whole lot worse. It's important to understand that after you get your private pilot license, most pilots will continue flying in the same aircraft that they trained on, because that's your opportunity to build up some hours flying solo and gain more confidence in the aircraft before you move on to something more advanced. Now, if you were doing the math earlier, Jenny only had 10.6 hours of experience flying solo when she got her private pilot license. And even though that technically met the FAA requirement, it seems like she relied heavily on flying with instructors. So it kind of surprised everyone when, instead of spending time focusing on the basics in her Piper Cherokee, in July of 2022, just 2 months after she passed her check ride, Jenny sold that aircraft and bought a 1965 Beech 35 Debonair. This was a huge step up for her. That's because the Debonair is considered a high-performance complex aircraft. It has retractable landing gear, a fuel-injected 260 horsepower engine, and a max cruising speed of about 160 knots. So it was definitely a lot more to handle than the Cherokee she had previously been flying. Also, the Debonair requires you to get specific endorsements to be able to fly it, something that the NTSB didn't really dig into during their investigation, other than to say that none of the endorsements were found in the undamaged section of her logbook, so it's not clear who gave Jenny the endorsements she needed or if she ever got them at all. Because if she did get them, then whoever provided those endorsements is basically saying that Jenny's capable of handling the aircraft. I also want to point out that according to multiple sources, one of the reasons why Jenny bought the Debonair was because not long after getting her private pilot certificate, she landed in the Piper Cherokee and tried to exit the runway at a high rate of speed and skidded off the taxiway into a ditch. Now, the aircraft itself was fine and it was easily repaired, but I'd argue that this should have been a clear warning sign that she didn't need to buy a more advanced and more powerful aircraft. Tragically, this wasn't going to be the only mistake that Jenny made. In fact, over the next several months, Jenny continued to fly her Debonair, building up hours and documenting her journey on YouTube. And in my previous video that I made shortly after her crash, I talked about one of those flights that she did in January of 2023 when she took off from runway 4 at the Rockwood Municipal Airport. And all she had to do was make an easy 45-degree turn to the right to head east to go to the Knoxville Downtown Airport. To be perfectly clear, this was a sunny day, weather was not a factor, and these were two airports that she was familiar with because she had flown out of them several times in the past. Unfortunately, according to her flight data, instead of turning to the east, she turned to the southwest, and then over the next 10 minutes, she made several 360-degree turns around the airfield before finally heading off in the right direction. And if you go back and watch my full video, you'll see that what happened was instead of looking outside and applying basic airmanship, she was focused on her iPad and trying to figure out what her autopilot was doing and trying to get the autopilot to fly the aircraft for her. Keep in mind that this was about 8 months after she got her private pilot certificate, and the lack of basic airmanship skills was astonishing to me, and I'd argue was yet another warning sign that Jenny never should have been allowed to fly by herself. However, now that you know a little bit more about Jenny and her new plane, it's time to talk about her instrument training and what else went wrong leading up to the crash. Jenny decided at some point during her aviation journey that she wanted to get her instrument rating, which would allow her to fly in the weather, and Aaron was one of the instructors that flew with her for a good portion of that training. According to the investigation, Aaron said that Jenny was very nice and always respectful and eager to learn, but she struggled with communication and had issues with the radios. A great example of that is in this video from her channel, where her instructor is trying to help her make a basic radio call to let the approach controller know what altitude they're climbing to.
If you want to practice it with me first, we're saying Chattanooga approach, Debonair 58901 Juliet, climbing to 6,000. And then you let go. But you
Which
can
approach were you on?
Chattanooga approach. Say it to me first. Yeah, make it so
Chattanooga approach, Debonair 58901 Juliet. Climbing. No, it was
yeah, climbing to 6,000.
climbing to 6,000.
Alright.
Juliet.
Alright, practice it again.
Number 9550, Romeo Chattanooga approach.
Okay, first of all, as a side note, the radio call should be Chattanooga approach, Debonair 58901 Juliet, 5,200, climbing 6,000. That's because you want to tell them what altitude you're at and what altitude you're going to. Regardless, Jenny kept thinking about it and she practiced the call for another minute before she would try to make the actual call on the radio.
But you can practice it with me one more time.
Chattanooga approach, Debonair 981er.
58901.
58901 Juliet, climbing to 6,000.
Yep.
All right. Chattanooga approach, 58901 Juliet, climbing to 6,000.
Now, don't take this the wrong way. I'm not trying to highlight every single mistake that Jenny made. That's not the point of a debrief. I wanted to share that video with you to show you how even after a few hundred hours of flight time, Jenny was still struggling with some of the most basic skills that she needed to be a pilot. And in full transparency, I don't know if that was Aaron in the video that I just shared with you, but what I do know is that Aaron said that when he flew with Jenny, sometimes he would have to take over the radio so she could focus on flying. Additionally, he said that she struggled more than others, her decision-making was something, and he felt that she needed a chance to gain more knowledge and experience. Aaron also told the NTSB that Jenny was over-reliant on technology instead of basic airmanship or stick and rudder skills, and the truth was that her fundamental skills were lacking, and she was further behind than what her total flight hours and approaches on paper would indicate. Despite the struggles that Jenny was having, I think there was a much bigger problem that wasn't being addressed. And I think it was the fact that perhaps she was more focused on the social media attention than she was on being a pilot. In fact, in this other video that she posted to her channel titled "My IFR Training, Was This Necessary?", her text on the screen at the start of the video says that it's about the landing, but I'd argue that she missed the bigger picture. Watch what happens.
Lined up, so just keep those triangles focused big on that, okay? A lot of your eyes I want your eyes to keep those triangles lined
Don't
up.
need to get down to 1500.
Yeah, that's fine. Keep those eyes over there as you do that. Go back to the left. Turn back to the left, big turn. Yeah, power down to 15 if you can. Bring that quicker. There you go.
Okay, first of all, you'll notice that she's wearing a pair of instrument training glasses that limit your vision to just the instrument panel. That way you can simulate flying in the weather. And it seems like what she's trying to do is fly an instrument approach, and the instructor is trying to get her to correct back to the left because you can see that they're lined up to the right of the runway. But watch what happens next.
Let that nose kind of relax on down. Gotta get her a little high. Back to the left a little bit more. Yeah, that big crosswind from the left is making it hard on you. Yeah, it's showing only about 40 degrees off our left now. Keep that left wing down. That opens it up to us, and it really takes us. All right, back to the left. Left wing down.
That wing keeps pushing me.
Pull up. Higher altitude. Pull up. Get higher. Up to the left. Up to the left.
The red circles on the video are ones that Jenny added herself, and I think she's trying to point out how they aren't lined up with the runway and perhaps how the instructor isn't taking the controls and correcting for her. But in my opinion, the whole point of the lesson is to allow you to make mistakes up to a certain point, because that's the only way you're going to learn. Watch what the instructor does though.
Yeah, pull back. All right, my controls. Let's go visual.
I got it.
All right, your controls now. Sorry, the wind just took us at the last second there.
To be perfectly clear, the wind did not take them at the last second. Jenny wasn't applying the correct control inputs to stay aligned with the runway during the approach, and I think the instructor was just trying to be nice. However, I think he should have said, "Okay, Jenny, you're at minimums and you don't see the runway. What do you do?" Because that's going to force her to do a go-around, hopefully, and then I would have had her take off her glasses to see where she was in relation to the runway, because it really drives home the point about how difficult it is to fly an approach in the weather and the decision-making process when you reach minimums. Instead, he took the controls and he corrected for her, and then he had her fly the rest of the approach visually, but what Jenny did next in the video was the most shocking part to me. Watch and read the text that she added on the screen. Folks, to be honest, I'm not sure what point she was trying to make, because if she was flying this in the weather down to the minimums, then she might only have 3 seconds to decide if she's going to try and salvage the approach and land or just go around. And if the instructor wasn't there to help her, then she'd probably be dead. However, she doesn't seem to realize that, and instead she's focused on blaming the instructor for setting her up for a bad landing. Now, as frustrating as that might be to watch, it was just one of many examples from her videos of how she seemed to refuse to humble herself and admit that she might not be suited to be a pilot. Regardless, when it comes to the investigation, I think one of the most important things that an instructor said about Jenny was she could fly the airplane, it was decent, but she needed help consistently. If an experienced instructor or pilot were not there in the right seat, she would likely not do well between the radios, communication, and managing the aircraft. I imagine she would get behind or lose situational awareness quickly. Okay, please don't take this the wrong way, because I'm sure there's a lot more to the story than a quote on a piece of paper, but in my opinion, you can't say that Jenny can fly the aircraft while at the same time saying that she needed an experienced instructor or pilot in the right seat flying with her. She was either capable of flying the plane by herself or she wasn't. 2 weeks before the accident, a man named Wayne, who was the general manager of the flight school that Jenny trained at, conducted an instrument phase check with her, and it did not go well. According to Wayne, at one point while she was flying an approach, she was told to go around, which is where you apply power and start climbing away from the ground. But instead, Jenny failed to use power and started descending towards the mountains. After that, the flight continued to get worse, and they had to stop the training session. Wayne would go on to say that Jenny had over 150 hours, and he's likely referring to the hours that she gained after getting her private pilot certificate, but either way, she should have been much further ahead. She rarely knew where she was in relation to her navigation, and she was flying a complex, high-performance airplane with an avionics package she wasn't familiar with. Additionally, all of the instructors that flew with her had difficulty with her. I think one of the reasons why Jenny struggled so much is because of what the NTSB discovered after the crash. According to the autopsy report, this is a list of the medications found in Jenny's system when she died. And if you're not familiar, Xanax is often used to treat anxiety and panic disorders, and it can cause increased sedation, reduced concentration, and reduced inhibitions. Trazodone is used to treat major depression, anxiety, and panic disorders, and it may slow your thinking and impair your motor skills. And buspirone is used for anxiety and may cause dizziness. Now, as you've probably imagined, you're not allowed to take any of those 3 drugs as a pilot because all 3 of them are on the FAA Do Not Fly list. To make matters worse, one of the other drugs in her system that's used to treat and prevent nausea actually disqualifies you from getting an FAA medical certificate due to the side effects including serious heart rhythm issues, drowsiness, and dizziness. But the thing is, as far as we know, no one had any idea that Jenny was on so many drugs. That's because when you go to do your FAA medical exam, you're required to self-report any medications that you're taking, but the only thing that Jenny told her doctor was that she used some over-the-counter stuff for seasonal allergies. And I'd argue that it's possible that she had been on some, if not all of these medications for a while, because that would explain the issues that we saw with the radio communications I shared with you earlier in this video, and also why she struggled so much with learning how to fly. Because for the amount of flight hours that she had, there's not many other reasons to explain what was going on. However, in full transparency, even though the NTSB said that Jenny may have been impaired, they couldn't determine if that contributed to the crash, considering her demonstrated baseline proficiency in the aircraft. Basically, that's just a fancy way of saying that her skills were so bad that they don't know if the medication really mattered when it comes to what happened. Either way, according to the NTSB, as of August of 2023, almost 4 months prior to the crash, Jenny had logged just over 390 hours of flight time, and in September, she made this post to Instagram highlighting the fact that she hit 400 hours, and over 200 of those hours were in the Debonair. And now that you know more about Jenny's story and her struggles, it's time to talk about what went wrong during her last flight. On December 7th, 2023, the day of the crash, Jenny and her father showed up at the airport to get ready for the flight. Wayne, the flight school general manager, happened to be there, and Jenny told him that they were waiting for the weather to improve, and the plan was to take the aircraft to an avionics shop in Little Rock for an upgrade. Wayne talked to her again about her instrument trading and told her that she was way behind the Debonair and she had purchased more aircraft than she was ready for. Jenny and her father did not disagree when Wayne repeated this assessment. Despite the warning, Jenny and her dad hopped in the plane and took off a few minutes later. There was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft, and weather was not a factor in what happened during the flight. Additionally, even though Jenny had a few cameras in the aircraft, it seems that one of them wasn't turned on to record the flight, and the NTSB wasn't able to recover any data from the memory card on the other camera, so they had to rely on the ADSB data and what they found in the wreckage. The first 30 minutes of the flight seemed relatively uneventful, at least when compared to Jenny's other flights. They were supposed to climb to an altitude of 6,500 feet, but they ended up settling down around 6,300 feet, and it seems like the autopilot was on, but they were having some minor deviations in altitude. This is where you need to know that the Debonair she was flying was equipped with a Century 2000 autopilot that could help her hold a constant altitude. However, the problem is that the autopilot doesn't have an auto trim feature. And what that means is that you should manually trim the aircraft for level flight before you turn the autopilot on. But if your airspeed changes, then you might need to adjust the trim later. And when we look at the flight data, we can see large fluctuations in airspeed as much as 20 to 30 knots when Jenny was trying to hold that altitude of 6,500 feet. And there was about a 10-minute period where they would descend down to about 6,000 feet and then climb back up to 6,500, and they did that at least 3 times. However, she never made any radio calls during that period to reflect any struggles that she was having with the aircraft. Keep in mind that this is a fairly simple problem to solve. All she needed to do was turn off the autopilot and hand fly the aircraft. Just basic airmanship skills. Otherwise, if she wanted to use the autopilot, the Century 2000 will actually sense when that trim is out of position, and then it flashes a light on the annunciator panel telling you to either trim up or trim down. Now, because the aircraft doesn't have an electrical trim switch on the yoke, that meant Jenny needed to reach down to the manual trim wheel and just manually apply whatever correction that it was telling her to. The NTSB later discovered that Jenny had a lot of problems understanding this system. According to one of her instructors, sometimes she would trim up or down the wrong way, and the autopilot would blink faster and faster, basically telling her that she's trimming in the wrong direction. If we go back to the flight data, you can see the series of oscillations in altitude kept getting worse and worse, and most likely what's happening is that Jenny is essentially fighting the autopilot this entire time. It's telling her to trim up, but instead she's trimming down, and vice versa. Now, in the past, when something like this happened, her instructor said that Jenny would get flustered and she would just disconnect the autopilot and fly manually. And perhaps she tried to do that at some point, but she never reestablished level flight. So chances are she was fighting the autopilot the entire time and completely unaware that her trim inputs were actually making things worse. At one point, the controller told her that she appeared to be left of course, and she said she was correcting, but that was the least of her worries, because as the altitude oscillations got bigger, the harder they became to control, and the NTSB said that what happened is that she probably eventually disconnected the autopilot, but by that point it was too late, and the aircraft had so much nose-down trim applied that it pitched forward into a steep dive, and as the airspeed began to rapidly increase, it became impossible for her to apply the control forces necessary to recover, as their rate of descent exceeded 10,000 feet per minute until they crashed into the ground below, killing Jenny and her father instantly. When I first talked about this tragedy a few years ago, I highlighted how Jenny recorded most of her flights, so she had everything that she needed to conduct a full debrief every time she flew, but there's no evidence that she ever did that. She knew she wasn't supposed to fly based on the medications that she was taking, and it seemed like multiple people tried to warn her that she was in over her head, but I don't think she wanted to listen to what they were saying. It's an incredibly tragic story of an accident that was years in the making, and my hope is that this debrief has helped you learn 3 things. First of all, being a pilot is an incredible responsibility, and that means knowing the rules and following them. Second, just because you have the flight hours, that doesn't mean that you know what you're doing, and if your instructor tries to warn you, then you better listen. But perhaps most importantly is the fact that you need to master the basic stick and rudder skills necessary to fly before you start using the automation. And then when you use the automation, you need to fully understand it or just turn it off, otherwise you're going to get yourself killed. If you want to see more about Jenny's flying, be sure to watch this video on your screen that I released shortly after her plane crash, and I hope you learned something from her story. Thanks so much for watching and for your support, and I'll see you on the next debrief.